got this microphone, but can everybody hear me all right without
Yes, sir.
That's the benefit of being an old school teacher and an attorney. Kind of learn how to project a little bit. Glad all y'all showed up today. Happy 158th anniversary of the capitulation of Vicksburg, and happy 4th of July as well to everybody. As you said, my name's Leonard Curtis. I've worked here for a number of years as a ranger, worked as an assistant historian for a while. Spent a couple of seasons over on the Cairo gunboat, which disappointed my southern father that I was serving on a Yankee gunboat for a couple of years, because my folks, we were actually right up here, right behind me, the 38th Mississippi. My third great-grandfather, Armstrong Flowers, was in the trenches directly behind me here during the siege of Vicksburg. So we have a long-time connection, I guess, with this area. And so the surrender is of a particular importance. Now, of course, Vicksburg, Mississippi, y'all understand it was one of the most important things that happened in the Civil War. The control of the Mississippi River was a vital strategic endeavor for both the South and the North. When the North had formulated their plan to capture the South, they had set up basically a three-point plan called the Anaconda Plan. The first was a blockade along the southern seacoast to cut off the South from trade with foreign powers. The second was control of the river. And then once the control of the river was acquired, they would then cut the life out of the South through campaigns cutting inland, squeezing the life out of the Confederacy like the coils of a giant anaconda, hence the name Anaconda Plan. Okay, so we are at this point in phase 2. They are trying to acquire the Mississippi River, and by the time the siege of Vicksburg happens, we have Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Port Hudson, Louisiana, controlled by the Confederacy. And that stretch of river between those 2 points is the only stretch of that river that is left. The North has come up the mouth of the river and down from the northern reaches of the river. They've captured New Orleans, they've captured Memphis, they've captured all these ports along the river until only Vicksburg and Port Hudson remain by the summer of 1863. After a campaign, Grant has managed to maneuver his forces south of the city. They marched inland as far as Jackson, Mississippi, turned around, came back, tried to attack the city twice by direct assault on May 19th and May 22nd. They would pour out of those trench lines that you can see behind you, run through this ground that we're on right now, trying to attack the works that are behind us. Obviously, both of those failed, and this resulted into a siege. Okay, so Pemberton was from Pennsylvania. A lot of his men distrusted him for those reasons. Later on, as the siege began to wear on, they began to question his loyalty to things, because obviously siege brings with it deprivations. Okay, they're cut off from everybody else. You've got 30,000 Confederate soldiers plus the population of the city of Vicksburg, surrounded by 12 miles of Union trenches by the end of the war, or the siege rather. The war is going to last a couple more years, unfortunately, after this. And so trying to feed those people becomes a daily problem. So the rations are cut, and then they're cut again, and they're cut again. And so by the time that we're reaching the end of the siege, the men are subsisting on a cube of bacon, a little square hardtack bread, maybe a handful of beans, if they can get them. And so on June 28th, a very interesting letter is delivered to General Pemberton that is signed many soldiers. We don't know exactly who wrote the letter, whether it was even written by the Confederacy. There's some ideas that possibly it was written by the Union and floated in on a kite and dropped into the city, and as a way to sort of push the Confederacy toward surrender. But it's a nice little letter that describes how brave the Confederate soldiers are, how much they really want to keep fighting. But the problem is, men are not going to starve. If you can't feed us, you ought to surrender us. That's one of the lines from the letter. Because men, once they get hungry, they're going to do what they're going to do. And rather than have this brave army, succumb to the rigors of hunger, they ought to be honorably surrendered by their commander. So that comes in on June 28th. Pemberton files that away. it's actually lost for many years. It's found in the Pemberton papers later on by researchers. So but it's something we don't know how much weight Pemberton actually gave to it, but it certainly was enough for him to keep it, file it away in his papers. So keep that in mind, that he's got this letter signed by many soldiers, supposedly in his command, saying, if you can't feed us, you gotta let us go. Now the whole siege, they've been waiting for Joseph E. Johnston. Joseph E. Johnston is a Confederate general that is the overall theater commander here in Mississippi. He actually arrived in May of 1863 after recovering from a wound he suffered up in Virginia. He was the Confederate commander in Virginia, was wounded at the Battle of Fair Oaks in 1862, which led to the rise of a guy named Robert E. Lee, which some of you may have heard of. He actually took Joe Johnston's job when Johnston got wounded. When Johnston recovers, he obviously can't get his job back from Robert E. Lee. They're not going to fire Lee at this point. And so they shipped Johnston out to Mississippi to try to deal with a rapidly deteriorating situation over here. But Johnston has been raising what he calls the Army of Relief over in Jackson. And Pemberton is waiting for that army to show up. And they wait, and they wait, and they wait. But by the beginning of July, they've been waiting a couple of months now. And Johnston is still no closer to moving. And so Pemberton polls his commanding generals. Says, look, what are our options? Doesn't look like Johnston's coming. Do we surrender, or do we try to break out? Do we have the strength? Do our men have the capacity to suit up, charge out, bust a hole in the Yankee lines, and escape? So basically, by this point, he's accepted that Vicksburg is gone. They're going to abandon it, or they're going to surrender it, one of the two. Okay, so Vicksburg, in his mind, is already gone. It's just a matter of how that's going to happen. So he polls his division commanders. Only one of them actually speaks up at that point. Stephen D. Lee says, we ought to hold this thing as long as possible. Okay, but everybody else, it's time. It's time to talk about surrender. We don't have the strength to bust out. Lee was the only one that thought they did. Okay, now Lee went on to become one of the commissioners that formed this park in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it founded Mississippi State University, which just won a national championship in baseball. So maybe that stick-to-itiveness, came through him to his school as well. I'm a big Mississippi State fan, so I had to plug that in there. All right, but Lee is the only one that stands and says we can do it. Everybody else is hopeless. The men haven't eaten. They're dead. But they got, they had 30,000 men when they started the siege. They're down to less than 20,000 effectives. There's over 5,000 men a day in the hospitals in the city. They're sick. They're weakened. They cannot do this. And so Pemberton decides to send a letter out to General Grant, the federal commander here, and he entrusts it to his most able commander, a guy named John Stevens Bowen. Now, John S. Bowen is a major general. He's from St. Louis, Missouri, and he was a neighbor of Grant in St. Louis when Grant lived there. In fact, he used to buy firewood. Grant would chop firewood to try to make money, and Bowen was one of his customers. And so they thought that friendship might be advantageous in working out good terms. And so south of us here, along what's known as the Baldwin Ferry Road, Pemberton and Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Montgomery of Pemberton's staff would ride out on the afternoon of July 2nd under a flag of truce. They would exit the works, and as soon as they came out, they were shot at by the Federals because Colonel Montgomery had gotten the flag wrapped around the pole and they couldn't see the white flag. So quickly unfurling that, they managed to ride on out. They were met by Federal forces. A man from the 96 Ohio meets them and escorts them on into the lines. They're blindfolded so that they can't know where the general's tents are. And they're taken to the command tents of Stephen Burbridge. Now, Burbridge, as you came in the park, he was the first bust you saw on the left. He's one of the federal generals, but he's actually sick, and so he's unable to actually meet with him, so he sends one of his staff officers. Staff officer takes the note from Bowen, rides to General Grant, and gets Grant's answer. And Grant will pin back a little answer that will basically say, you can stop. the effusion of blood anytime you want to by simply unconditional surrender. And that's his mantra. He got that U.S. grant, unconditional surrender grant, up at Fort Donelson back in February of 1862. He's kind of built his reputation on the idea that he doesn't offer terms to rebels. So unconditional surrender is on the table. If you want it, take it. Otherwise, I propose to resume hostilities. And so Bowen gets the note back from Grant and realizes Pemberton's not going to go for that. So this is going to continue to drag on and drag on. Now, I will say Pemberton was probably, again, the hardest fighting, most capable general in the Southern Army here at Vicksburg. However, he has contracted something called dysentery during the siege. Now, dysentery is a horrible intestinal tract disease. It's basically, diarrhea on steroids, and it will eventually kill John Bowen a couple weeks after the end of the siege. So he's in the throes of dysentery, and knowing that he's got to now ride back in and tell Pemberton they're not going to give us any terms, and that's just going to lead to this thing dragging out even more when everybody, Pemberton even has already acknowledged that this is hopeless at this point. It's just a matter of how do we end it. And so he says, well, I'll take your note back, but if General Pemberton wants to talk, would General Grant be willing to do that? And they say, well, sure, yeah, General Grant will be glad to meet Pemberton if he wants to meet. You just name the place and time. So Bowen says, if Pemberton wants to meet, we're going to fly a white flag of surrender right up here behind me, where the Jackson Road meets the Confederate fortifications. 38th Mississippi, where my third great-grandfather is sitting. So they're going to fly that white flag of surrender at 3 p.m. on July the 3rd, if Pemberton wants to meet. And so then Bowen rides on back in to Vicksburg, takes the note to Pemberton. Pemberton, of course, reads it. There's no way. Unconditional surrender. The men have fought too hard, too long. They deserve better than just simply no terms and just throwing themselves on the mercy of the Federal Army. And so Bowen then says, well, General Grant said he'd be interested in talking to you. If you want to talk to him, we just got to put a flag up, 3 p.m., Jackson Road, and they'll ride out and meet and talk about terms. So Pemberton's like, sounds good to me. So, 3 p.m., they fly the flag. Out rides Pemberton, Bowen, Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery. Meeting them from this side of the field will be General Ulysses S. Grant, James Birdseye McPherson, General E.O.C. Ord, General A.J. Smith, and some of Grant's staff officers, people like that. And they'll all ride in. And Grant had come up a little bit earlier, and so his men had gathered up on this little hill behind me with a little stone wall where you see the cannon tube in the ground now. One of the features of the battlefield at that time was a stunted little oak tree that had somehow survived the days of siege, weeks of siege, and managed to keep its position there in front of the Confederate works. And so while they were waiting on the Confederates to show up, they had kind of picked a little shady spot. We're sitting around waiting on them. And so Bowen rides out. He makes the introductions. Even though Grant and Pemberton knew each other, they had actually both served in William Worth's Mexican War divisions back in the Mexican War. So they knew each other. They had fought with each other. They were coupled. But he still felt the need to make the formal introductions. And everybody does their little normal pleasantries. And then there is an uncomfortable silence. Pemberton is waiting for Grant, who supposedly wants this meeting. Grant waiting for Pemberton, who has supposedly wanted this meeting. And so finally Pemberton breaks the silence by saying, it's my understanding you want an interview. And Grant says, you are mistaken. You're the one that wanted the interview. And they both kind of turn to look at Bowen. And so Pemberton regains his composure, says, well, what terms can you offer for the surrender of Vicksburg? And Grant says, as my letter said, unconditional surrender is my only term. And that incenses Pemberton. He throws his finger in Grant's face and he says, I assure you, sir, you will bury many more of your men before you enter Vicksburg. He says, you may have rumors that our foodstuffs are running out. Those are exaggerations. We have plenty of food. We have plenty of ammunition. And Port Hudson has even more than we've got. We'll continue to hold this spot indefinitely. Okay? And so Bowen, seeing things kind of getting out of hand, steps in and says, why don't we step over here in the shade, see if we can't hash things out. And so Pemberton says, fine with me. Grant says, that's fine with me. Pemberton asks if he can bring Bowen and Montgomery. Grant brings A.J. Smith and James McPherson. And those people break away from the main group, come up under the shade of the oak tree, and begin talking about surrender terms. Now, Grant and Pemberton kind of just moved to the side and actually just had their own private conversation, which probably consisted of reminiscences of the Mexican War service they had together, while it is the two subordinates from each side that sort of hash out the arrangements. And they try different ideas, pitching back and forth, but they can't come up with an agreeable plan for both sides. But Grant, before the meeting breaks away, says, I'll tell you what, Pemberton, I'm going to go back, I'm going to think about it. You'll have my final terms by this evening. And so he rides back to his headquarters. The Confederates go back into town to their headquarters. And sure enough, later that evening, they receive a communication from General Grant that offered the surrender of Vicksburg in exchange for the Confederate men, the rank and file, would march out of their trenches on July 4th. They would stack their arms. They would take no personal property with them. Officers would be allowed to take a horse and a sidearm. They would then be allowed to move to parole camps in Enterprise and Demopolis, Alabama, is where these eventually ended up being. And they would be taken there by their officers, and they would await exchange. Back in those days, you could exchange prisoners with each side. And so they would wait until they received notification that an equal number of federal troops had been exchanged for the Army of Vicksburg. And so Pemberton then takes these messages and calls another council of war and says, all right, this is what we've got. It's a little better than unconditional surrender. Who thinks we ought to surrender? Everybody except two. William Baldwin says we ought to hold this place as long as we possibly can. And Stephen D. Lee says, hey, we ought to just keep waiting. Johnston might be coming. You never know. All right? But those are the only two that hold out again. So the majority of the Confederate High Command, including Bowen, say let's surrender. And so Pemberton shakes his head. He goes, I'd rather cut my way out of here with a sword, but I'm going to acquiesce to you guys. Since most of you seem to want to surrender, well, I will notify General Grant that we accept his terms. They send out the riders. The surrender is accepted by General Grant. And then on July 4th, the Confederate men finally come out of these trenches that they'd held for 47 days. They stack their arms. Their officers are allowed again to keep one horse, one sidearm. They got 30 wagons of rations that they could take from and supplies they could take from the Confederate garrison. And they were, over the next few days, paroled. They signed their oaths, swearing they would not fight until exchange. And then within the next couple of weeks, they were all headed to Alabama to await exchange. A good chunk of them never made it to Alabama, including my third great-grandfather. He lived in Claiborne County, just south of here. And when the regiment reforms, he's AWOL for the rest of the war. So I think he just left and went home at that point. I think a lot of them did as well. But who could blame them? 47 days of siege. Pretty much over with after that. So with that, Grant captures the city of Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863. Now this goes on to couple with Lee's retreat from Gettysburg, because at the same time that all this was been going on, Lee and General Meade had been fighting the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And so on the 4th is when Lee begins his retreat. And so I've always described that as sort of a 1-2 punch that sort of just knocks the Confederacy out. You know, you can't survive both of those. Maybe if you win Gettysburg, you can overcome the loss of Vicksburg. Keeping Vicksburg and losing Gettysburg, you might still win. Losing them both at the same time, that just knocks the wind out of the Confederacy's sails. It removes an entire field army from the war. 30,000 Confederates are just off the board for the Confederacy in the middle of the war right there. So, I mean, that is a huge manpower loss. And then, of course, the navigation of Mississippi is interrupted by the capture of the city. Port Hudson will fall on July 9th once they realize that Vicksburg is no longer in the picture. There's no sea. You can't hold 1 point. You got to have two to control the river. So Port Hudson finally gives up after 48 days of siege, making it the longest true siege in American history. Petersburg goes 9 months, but they weren't completely surrounded at Petersburg. So Port Hudson likes to hold that one over Vicksburg's head, that they held out for one more day than Vicksburg did. But it's an awesome site. If you ever get down to Louisiana, please check out Port Hudson. It's a state historical site. It's very worth your time down there. But the impact of this obviously allows the second half of the Anaconda Plan to finally come to fruition, and that launches the North into the third, which is the inland campaigns. The campaigns through Mississippi over to Meridian, to Chattanooga, the march to the sea, the march to the Carolinas. All of that is part of that effort to just squeeze the life out of the Confederacy in that third part. The only way they got to that was what happened here on July 4th, 158 years ago. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to field them.